Thank you so much, and for that generous introduction. And it's good to see you. I love coming to these events because I get to see Anne every now and then. So it's great. I'm glad I could make it out here, and greetings to all of you.
Louder, please.
Is it better? Thank you. I'll start again. Glad to see all of you, and I'm glad I could make it here this evening. It's interesting to reflect on the United Nations 80 years later, an incredible milestone, given all of the historical things we've seen in our world, whether locally, internationally, and how they've played out in the existence of humanity. But it's a day when we also are asked not just to remember the world we've inherited, but to imagine the world we will build next. As young leaders, dreamers, change makers, and also, those who came for the snacks, that's okay. I'm serious, don't worry about it, because snacks have actually kept peace in many situations where the UN even could not. But as you heard, my name is Nupolu Johnson, and it's an honor to be speaking here because I've seen both sides firsthand of the UN. Whether it was doing the war as a child in Liberia, or the 8 years on refugee camps, or now being a United Nations fellow, where I'm often in Geneva, Switzerland, and in these halls and in these different meetings, it has been interesting to reconcile both sides as you see it. At one point in my life, I was angry at the UN, and then at another point in my life, I was like, after all, maybe we can do something with this. So today, I'm going to talk about a few things, and one of that would be looking at the UN from a decolonized perspective. Because we cannot ignore the fact that these institutions, a lot of them, came from a certain reality. Whether we agree with it or disagree with it, that's not the conversation. The conversation is, how do we make sure that today's reality is relevant in these institutions? And that's where I would like to focus my brief remarks. And I want to have it as a real conversation, and a decolonized one as well, of a global change. But before we begin, let me tell you this story. I see the UN as not being inherently good or bad, because it's easy for people to just look at circumstances around, or whether it's a crisis or war, and immediately assign characteristics to these institutions, especially the UN, given the difficult role it often has to play. I see it like a knife. In the hands of a chef, it creates nourishment, joy, community. Sometimes I like to say jollof rice, for those of you who like that, and everything good in the world. But in the hands of a robber, that same knife becomes a tool of fear and destruction. So the question is not whether the UN is good or bad. The question is, whose hands is it in? And how are they using it? And history shows us both sides of what that tool has been used for, or ways that it hasn't been used. So I like to call it the paradox of harm and healing, because harm, it doesn't only happen by actions, sometimes it happens from inaction. We have seen moments where the United Nations have failed in catastrophic ways, and sometimes unforgivable. We saw it in Rwanda in 1994, and the list can go on to Congo and other places. When the world stood by as more than 800,000 innocent lives were taken in just 100 days. We saw it when the tool was in the wrong hands, with the wrong will, and with the wrong curse. But it's easier to look back in hindsight, I often say, before we be too judgmental. We also have to see the UN being used with wisdom, purpose, and courage. And this is where I like to look at it. When we look at Namibia, whether it was UNAC, organizing the transition to independence from apartheid control, going to successful democracy building. Mozambique, ending the Civil War and managing to sustain that peace. Liberia and Sierra Leone, supporting the transition from brutal civil wars that were intertwined to stability being restored. Côte d'Ivoire, most recently. Again, conflict resolution and stabilization, preventing violence for overtaking peaceful dialogue. But here's the lesson. The UN can fail tragically, but it can also heal nations, just like the kitchen knife. So how do we do that? The United Nations is only as strong as the people and the movements that shape it. And that's why we need a different and a decolonized approach. Here's the problem. For decades, global development has acted like only governments and big institutions matter and diplomats in high boardrooms. But if your own life and our lives has taught us anything, is that real change does not begin in the castle, neither in the boardroom. It begins in the village. It begins on the front lines. It begins in the community. It begins in places like Bridges Cafe, on the streets, not in the state, not in the government, but in the people. And people like to call it grassroots organizing, right? Community innovators, young leaders, everyday citizens are the quiet architects of the world we hope for, as rooted in these sustainable development goals surrounding us today. Grassroots organizations, and yet in the global development system, grassroots efforts have been treated as charity work, to be funded or to not be funded, to be considered or to not be considered. Temporary relief or small-scale interventions, as they like to create these acronyms. In fact, we call them grassroots as if they are the grass under our feet, when actually they are the roots holding the whole tree up. When it gets too dangerous that everybody has to be flown out or airlifted, that nobody can go in safely, it is the only thing that's left. It is the only thing that keeps the place holding together until it is safe enough for anyone else to go in. Now let me make this a bit personal. When I was resettled to Canada, a bunch of my friends and I, on the same campus, in the same room, started Empowerment Squared. Not because I was trying to start an organization, to be honest. I was simply trying to repay a debt I forever owe humanity for the 8 years that I went through those refugee camps by myself. And I speak to them not as an observer, but someone who had lived the urgency of the conversation. And there are two things I will close on to talk about what I call the decolonized approach. I grew up during Liberia's Civil War. And I remember when I got to Canada, everybody talked to me about things from a system level up. Whenever you talk about anything big, people ask you all these questions that was in their subconscious, sometimes without even realizing. They were basically telling you, you cannot do it. And the idea of Empowerment Square started not because there was a big dream to go and change the world or to go and change Liberia or wherever else in the world. It started because the SDGs is our lives. It's not a theory to be studied. Quality education, right? Gender equality, all of it is what we live. So if we would do anything about our lives, I'm not waiting for the UNAC declaration. The SDGs is already enough as a tool for us to leverage. When we started Empowerment Squared from $0, Ann just reminded me in one of those early board meetings, they had to call an in-camera meeting to decide how they were going to pay my salary because they couldn't believe how much I was making. So now an organization of $5 million a year, solving system problems not only in Canada, but across the world. I just returned from West Africa, Liberia, where we built something now that everybody's trying to figure out how it was possible. The president of Liberia says, in his opinion, this is the greatest investment in the country's history. These were grassroots people, individual donors from $100 to $20 to $1,000 to $300,000, you name it. And they trusted a small organization whose budget was under $100,000 to take this money and go do what it did. I'm telling you this story because I didn't need anybody's approval to envision the SDGs in that regard. In my opinion, I tell people the building was not my problem. The problem was to show that this can be done without necessarily the status quo of state actors. We've seen state actors do well, but we've also seen them fail tragically. The only thing that has been missing is the people. And if we look at the UN from a decolonized approach, then we need to fill in that gap. We need to start strengthening the networks of people, individuals, small organizations, big one, that we do not need to wait for state actors. Instead, they will catch up with us at some point. I jokingly tell people in Liberia, wish someone said I might go to jail for it. You know, politicians are good at building shanks and makeshift shacks and calling them things. Library, community center, whatever they call them. So I had about 200 kids at the Learning Center when I was just there, and I said it publicly that if any politician comes anywhere and builds some kind of shack with state money and tell you it's a library, hold their hand and tell them, since you've never seen a library in your life, let me take you to the Learning Center and show you what a library looks like. Reject it. Because the Learning Center is now the minimum standard. You either match it or you exceed it. And the system levels I went in there, no electricity in Liberia, we produce electricity. I made a commitment that the building would never go off under any circumstance. So we're running on solar. Since December, we are producing about 100 kVA of power. Liberia is blessed with abundance of sunshine. First time in the country. We've never run out of power, and we intend to keep it that way. Water, we're running on rainwater. Liberia, Monrovia is one of the wettest capitals in the world. So we harvest the rainwater and run it back into the building. Building, we build with earth compressed bricks, the clay from under your feet. There is no air conditioning in the building, and Liberia is hot. But because of the simple clay technology, it keeps the building cool. So something that no one has been able to solve in a 178-year history. Mobilizing citizens were able to bring it apart. You can take the building and put it in the middle of the forest and it operates. And the last one is the issue of drug abuse that we've tackled. Everybody's complaining about it. We got the Canadian government to put in about $5 million to do 3 years of system-level research to figure out how we solve this problem. As I speak to you, 20 young Canadians are in Liberia and Ghana for the next 4 months, working with their peers and counterparts in the communities to try and work with them to figure out how do we understand this problem. So I will close by saying this. Whether it's your campus club, or your organization, or UNAC, or CIC, whichever one, I'm telling you today that we've lost some innovation at the top. And there's plenty of it down here. I urge you, on this 80th anniversary of the UN, do your part within your means. Whatever that means is. In Hamilton, on campus, in your family, your country of origin, wherever it is, find your sphere of influence and do your part within your means without worrying what will happen or where it will end up. Just give account of yourself. So let's change the UN. Let's not imagine what it's only done. Let's learn from what it has done. Let's try to correct the mistakes, but let's imagine how we can build the UN and not the UN building up, because systems don't save or build themselves. It is people that save them and build them. Thank you.